This is a very interesting game because on one hand, it does a lot very well. The game is beautiful, the music is heavily inspired by Nier Automata, giving it a very relaxing and memorable tone to the game. The bosses are honestly worth the purchase price alone. They're cinematic, challenging, unique when compared to everything else in the game, and are a spectacle all the way through. Plus, who could say no to the ass that's overloading all Rule 34 websites right now? Yeah, she is pretty hot, which is also the reason why this game is surrounded by controversy. Just know that I won't be considering them in my review, as I believe that it deviates from the real discussions that we should be having in its stead. More specifically, the world building and general story is almost non-existent. The world design also feels sterile and becomes less interesting as the game progresses. Worse still, I don't think that the combat is as good as it should be, and that issue has repercussions on the rest of the game. I don't think that it's good enough to last the runtime, so it makes the open world and general mission structure feel long at best and bloated at worst. This is the kind of game where at the halfway point, I got bored of going through the main gameplay loop. What started off as challenging ended up becoming too easy and lacking depth, making me wish that I was playing almost anything else. Although that 20% though, oh my god, it is so freaking good. It's impressive, it's memorable, it's energetic, and overall makes the core experience worth slugging through just to get to the next set piece. Humanity is on the brink of extinction. They lost the war against the Naitibas, a race of unknown origin which showed up at the end of the previous war and ended the conflict. And by ending it, I mean that the human race suffered severe casualties to the point that they had to abandon Earth and create a colony in outer space. Obviously, they couldn't just leave it at that, which is why the colony shoots soldiers periodically through the stratosphere of Earth, hoping that they'll be able to reclaim the land that was once theirs. We start the game during one of those attempts, and man, this is such a cool sight. We can immediately feel the struggles of war as Eve, our playable character, gets propelled towards Earth while all her colleagues are being blown to smithereens. The anarchy continues as those same ships crash onto the planet's surface, forcing us to avoid the debris while we're pushing forward. Comrades die all around us, and when we thought that the worst had passed, we encounter a really cool looking Elder Naitiba, which proceeds to rapidly kill the only other soldier that survived the landing. This is one of the best moments of the game, and it's one that also showcases the best thing that this game has going for itself. It uses the narrative in order to weave in epic battle sequences that are honestly a breath of fresh air, especially when compared to everything else that has come out in recent history. It reminds me of Astral Chain because the game feels like you're going through an amusement park, walking through one battle sequence to another, not knowing when something exhilarating was potentially waiting for you just around the corner. If it's not the bosses that impress, it's the environment design that leaves you speechless. Statues of a world lost in time tower over the once lived landscape. Among those ruins, a clock tower pierces the sky, reminding us that time no longer affects the world of the living. Ground level is often flooded, locking off parts of the world that could hold the next best thing in the game has to offer. As you can see, a lot of the heavy lifting is done by the level design, the environmental design, and the artistic flair that defines the gameplay experience. The devs really did their best to vary the maps, giving it a sense of grandeur to the world, and that's really awesome. But it's also the reason why I haven't really talked about the story more than I did. You see, once you get saved by the local survivor called Adam, you join forces and head towards the ruin. The plan is that you help him find a power source for the last bastion of humanity, and he in return will help you find the next Elder Naitiba. There are a total of 4 power sources that you need to find, and another 4 Elder Naitibas that you need to kill in order to unlock the path to the Naitiba nest. Find one, kill the boss, and receive an exposition dump. Rinse and repeat. Then get to the nest, complete the mission, and you're essentially done with the game. It's the reason why I stated that the game is uninterested in telling a concrete story. The main narrative is really just busy work because there isn't any narrative variety and barely any cutscenes that add to the world building. It also doesn't use this time to develop any of the characters because there really isn't more to it than that. There's a certain loneliness to the world which is probably intentional as this is a dystopian wasteland, although the side effect is that there isn't anything to really grip you as well. It's just you and your drone while your friends stay back to do whatever it is that they're doing. The game doesn't really make it clear, to be quite honest. It's a shame because that also means that for most of the game's runtime, the devs chose to neglect null narrative progression in favor of gameplay. I believe that they also acknowledged this issue during production and therefore decided to address it by sometimes adding dialogue when you get back to your camp. The rest area acts like your safe haven, letting you upgrade Eve and buy some consumables. When you do decide to unwind though, the game saves, fills your basic health item, and respawns all the enemies. It's during those moments that you might encounter a short 30-second-ish cutscene where Eve, Adam, and sometimes Lily discuss something generic that happened in the world. It's a good idea in concept, but to me, it highlights a bigger problem with the narrative. None of these characters receive any character development until the game requires it. In other words, Adam doesn't really talk about how he survived on a deserted planet or of all the tragedies that surrounded his lifestyle. He doesn't talk about the people he lost or the lessons that came from those obstacles. He doesn't have any trust issues, traumas, or anything else that you might imagine. He's just a good-looking guy that really wants to help the city of Zion. The same situation happens with Eve. Why did she become part of the airborne squad? What are the things that surprised her when arriving on Earth for the first time? How does it feel to have the weight of the mission rest entirely on her shoulders now that she's the last remaining soldier from her whole platoon? Who keeps leaving outfits for her, and why does that individual know her exact measurements? She honestly doesn't seem interested in any of that, which in turn makes it hard for us to feel any different. It's honestly quite odd because usually the dystopian setting is used in order to show the worst in all individuals. It's a time where basic commodities of life can no longer be taken for granted. It's an environment that pushes your limits and makes you question when you won't be able to cross the horizon. It's breathtaking, and it's that sadness, that drama that usually makes the story, which is why I don't understand why none of that ended up in the story until the last 15% of the game. Here's a concrete example that represents most of the game. It is a side quest that happens around the middle part of the story, and it's not related to the main quest at all, which means that there are no spoilers to be involved here. You'll be sprinting through the city of Zion when all of a sudden you encounter a wounded civilian. He'll tell you that both he and his sister were attacked by looters. He then begs you to ignore him and go up ahead and save his sister. You obviously accept without hesitation and head up the path behind him. Well, turns out that it was all a trap, and you end up with a sword launched through your spine. Somehow, this also knocks out your drone, which could have defended you with its guns, but let's not think about it too much. This cutscene is actually really significant because it's the first time that we encounter hostile humans. During the whole runtime up to that point, it was made clear that all humans are good and the Nightibas had to be killed on sight. Now we see that it's not as black and white because this group wants to dismantle you and sell you for spare parts. Then, once the cliche villain speech has reached its climax, Adam appears and kills all of them without any hesitation. Note that they also changed the model for these guys to the girls that we get permanent upgrades from. I presume that they did this because the model for the dead girls already existed, which means that they didn't have to create a new asset just for this little scene. But what do I know, right? Anyways, Adam tells us they didn't think that the black market merchants would dare attack us while picking us up so he can bring us to the ship. The reason this is significant is because the devs can use this in order to make Eve question her own values. We could see her lose faith in the cause, wondering if the few remaining survivors are even worth the effort. We also have no mention of the black market before this point, so it could also be the perfect moment to explore human trafficking, drug trafficking, or the general injustice in the world. She could also flip the narrative and instead question Adam. We could learn more about him and ask why he didn't hesitate to kill all those traffickers, as every life counts when fighting human extinction. Basically, it's a traumatizing event that Eve finds herself in, and you know what the devs decide to do when she wakes up? Absolutely nothing. She gets up and finds her teammates who are acting like nothing happened. The techie of the group, Lily, built a device that can track the next boss. Adam then compliments her and normal banter ensues. Lily then gropes your behind and now you're able to magically double jump for some reason. I don't know if I just got unlucky and me leaving the ship activated the next main cutscene, but combined, it just feels lazy. Even if you remove the second half and end the scene when we get up, we still get no payoff for what happens, so why even bother setting that whole scenario? There are a lot of missed opportunities like this all throughout the game, which often makes me wonder why the devs even attempted to create a main narrative. Here's one last example just to prove my point. The first time we meet Lily, we find her trapped inside the same type of pod that we used to land on Earth. The thing is that she was part of the 5th Airborne Squad while you're part of the 7th. Can you imagine how it feels to be trapped in that kind of solitude when you were stuck long enough to have your whole squad and the next one die before you even get out? How does the feeling of claustrophobia that definitely comes from being trapped inside the pod for so long affect her? What about the fear of not knowing what the sounds from the outside world originate from, and how much longer will it take to be stuck in there before rescue shows up? Well, neither do the devs, because she comes out of there happy and enthusiastic, which is representative of most of her scenes. The most concrete way that the devs ever attempt to create a new world building is with the huge amount of collectibles you can find in the world. You'll find corpses with notes on their person, which gives you a glimpse as to what the individual was thinking just before moving on to the great beyond. Turns out that most of them had no desires, loved ones, or even ambition. They all either complained about the AI called Mother Sphere, which I won't get into for spoiler reasons, or they simply have the opposite stance. That's it. I honestly kept collecting them because I couldn't believe that the devs couldn't think of anything interesting to write about. I would pick them up one after another, hoping to find one that would talk about literally anything else, and it rarely happened, honestly. I think that the first one actually appeared after completing like 40% of the game, which is insane. This also has an additional negative effect, which is that it makes the game even more repetitive than it already is. If, on the contrary, the game varied the lore and added something interesting, it would have felt rewarding to collect and would have therefore gotten invested in the world that they created. I praised it before for looking as good as it did, and that's honestly my original take on it. The world is beautiful, but it simultaneously isn't narratively rewarding to explore. It also loses its charm fast when you realize that it lacks the passage of time, as the layout feels sterile and video game-esque. Where are all the bodies from the deceased and the shadows made from their bloodstains? The bullet holes that permanently damage the infrastructure? Where are the ripped clothes that float in between all the trash? Actually, why is the layout as clean as it is? I mean, if there was indeed a war and everything was in ruin, it wouldn't look as clean as it does here. I know that what I'm asking for is quite extreme, but I'm doing this in order to prove a point, which is that it doesn't have much to offer in the story department, and it's made on purpose that way. The devs didn't create the opportunity for you to get attached to the characters because they were more interested in letting the player commit a genocide and looking good doing it. I think it's also why the story and its side quests are void of emotion. You accept a side quest where you have to find someone's missing cat, for example, only to then find it dead on the sidewalk. Well, who cares, right? At least we got paid. Oh, you found someone's dead husband? Well, pay me and I'll tell you where the body lies. You challenged me to a math quiz? For real? Well, why not, I guess? I think that it was done this way as a means to get you moving around the world. They've clearly invested more time in making it look stunning, but I don't think that it's as good as they thought it was. It's hard to get invested in the map's layout when all the enemy encounters look like programmed robots that never really attempt to leave the little area that they're protecting. They just wanted to create a map that looks like postcard material and that offered enough space for the combat. Also, it's really hard to get excited at anything really when all the collectibles that you collect are essentially just colored orbs that have a little pop-up at the top saying you got something rare. Honestly, I get that you needed a loot system and most of it are basically upgrades, but it's just not the same as getting a real weapon, for example. This now brings me to the elephant in the room. I've been avoiding this comparison for the whole video, but I'm at a point where that's no longer feasible. The reason the story is such a letdown, on top of all the reasons I've mentioned already, is because the game is really, and I mean really, trying to emulate Nier Automata. The combat looks very similar at first glance. The graphics and the artistic designs are comparable. The music is a competently made replica of the one that won awards in 2017. Lastly, the general synopsis of both games are extremely similar to the point that, if you've played Nier Automata, you'll rapidly be able to guess most of the story in Stellar Blade. This game feels like a summary of that game, and not in the best way, mind you. Like I've said previously, it barely has a story, and what is here isn't even clever or presented in an original way like in Nier Automata. I genuinely believe that if you haven't played it and you decide to jump into Stellar Blade first, then you'll definitely be able to have a better time because the comparison wouldn't exist for you. That's not to say that you won't be able to guess ahead of time where the story is going, because you certainly can. I'm just saying that you'll be more likely to be invested in it because Nier Automata is, well, one of the best games that I've ever played, period. The more I pushed myself through Stellar Blade, the more I was reminded of Automata, and if you hold that game in high regard like I do, then I don't think you'll be able to enjoy it that much. On the other hand, I think that we can all agree that this was probably done intentionally. The devs took a winning recipe and used it to ground their combat system, which isn't a bad thing. It just means that they really need to get it right because the success of the whole game rests on that system alone. For what it's worth, I do indeed think that they did a pretty good job. It's just that it isn't good enough to last the whole length of the game. Before I get into its issues, I want to make it clear that the devs build a combat system that works at its core. Unlike what you might expect, the combat revolves mainly around parrying attacks. Enemies attack rapidly, and every successful parry negates all damage and lowers a small counterbar found under its life bar. Once you've done that enough times, the enemy is stunned and therefore open to a finisher, which is always the highlight of the encounter. It's just so cool because you feel like a badass blocking all of those attacks just to then kill it with an adrenaline-packed cutscene. This mechanic is also present during boss encounters, which is really awesome. They're really challenging and can kill you in just a few hits if you are unlucky. You'll therefore always play on the defensive side and attempt to parry as many attacks as possible, hoping to take out the whole bar and feel that rush of dopamine when you activate the attack. The complexity doesn't really stop there. Learning what attacks you can actually parry, how many of them you can block in a row, and when it's time to retreat is always at the back of your mind. The game actually takes a lot from Souls games, believe it or not. If you don't parry perfectly, you negate some of the damage but not all of it. Plus, a missed parry can actually stun lock you for a few hits, so learning when to exit and execute a slow healing animation is key here. Bosses are especially challenging because they can chain multiple attacks, so missing a parry at the very start can often cost you the whole run. It's a really addicting loop, and it's one that's as difficult as it is beautiful. Speaking of beauty, there's a lot of different enemies in the game, with new ones being introduced at a decent pace. They all have cool designs, and they always make me want to continue playing it just to see what the next one was going to be. Combine that curiosity with the permanent health and power boosts that are hidden on the map, and you'll end up naturally enticing the player into exploring every nook and cranny of the level. Unfortunately, well, the problem with the gameplay is really everything else. When I started playing the game, I felt very conflicted about the core gameplay loop. For starters, there's no animation cancellation in the game. It means that you'll often get hit because the animation had to finish, which then led to you being stunned and therefore tanking 2, 3, sometimes even 4 attacks in a row. It kept pissing me off because it goes against the main philosophy of the game. It forces you to stop attacking, wait a few seconds so that you can execute a parry before continuing your assault. It really stops the flow of combat, which is quite weird for a game that wants to go fast and limber. Just a quick comparison, I've been playing Dante's Inferno recently, and I can't tell you just how better the combat feels because you never stop attacking the enemy. The difficulty comes from the timing of your blocks, dodges, range attacks, and more, so that you can dismember as many enemies as possible without taking too much damage. Stellar Blade, by contrast, doesn't seem to know what it wants to be. It wants to go fast but forces you to slow down. It has a really sticky auto-aim that activates whenever it feels like it, which makes fighting groups almost impossible. Actually, because the game puts so much emphasis on parrying, you basically can't fight groups because you can't block multiple attacks at the same time. You also get stunned when you get hit, so you can easily find yourself stuck in a situation where you just can't get yourself out of it. Add in the horrible dodge that barely goes anywhere, and you end up with a combat system that feels like it needed either more testing or a better idea of the genre that which it wanted to emulate. On the other hand, and this is where the discourse actually becomes interesting, once you accept this reality and play the game that the way wants you to, well, it becomes fucking easy. I praised it before for having a huge catalog of enemy designs, but I purposefully didn't mention that they all behave the same way. Killing them always involves you parrying their attacks until it's your turn to do the same. Enemies can't parry you for the most part, so slice away until you judge that it's time for you to stop the sequence and start anew. Also, if you ever don't feel like parrying an attack, you can always execute a special attack which usually cancels their attacks and deals a huge amount of damage. It also conveniently recharges with every successful parry. What started off as flashy and exciting becomes a means to an end. What also makes the situation worse is that you'll rapidly realize that all basic enemies fall under 6 archetypes. You'll have the small minions that are useless alone but annoying in groups. Those can immediately be overpowered and aren't really worth parrying, which means that you'll start avoiding them after a few hours in game. Next is the basic soldier that hits hard but telegraphs his attacks quite well. Most basic enemies fall in this category. Regardless if they wield a spear, a light or heavy weapon, or a shield, they all mainly have a similar timing, so only slight modifications are necessary on our end. Although later on, they do attempt to spice up the formula by adding creatures that take over deceased corpses in order to bring them back to life. It's interesting in concept because it forces you to make an ambush plan, as killing them when they're not in control of a host is a lot quicker and easier than fighting the same enemies you've been fighting the whole game. Plus, when you've defeated the husk, the thing then sprints towards another body, so killing them rapidly and efficiently is the desired outcome. Unfortunately though, the execution breaks it for me enemy, as the devs added too many corpses around them that they're almost guaranteed to grab one before even able to level the playing field. To make matters even worse, they're invincible during the morphing animation, stopping the flow of combat and forcing you to get back to basics. Also, you'll often end up attacking one of them, and by the time it's dead, the rest have already taken over a host, which means that you're up for a rough time. This is also where the auto aim also rears its ugly head, because I kept trying to select the weakling, only to end up constantly being bounced around like a pinball machine. It therefore got repetitive and annoying fast, so in the end, I actually started skipping those encounters altogether. Moving on, we also have the gunners, which usually don't have any melee attacks and therefore try to keep a distance. Your strategy is therefore to always eliminate them first before moving on to the previous type on the list, because they can cause some serious damage if left unchecked. Next, you have the tentacle monsters, which have an interesting gimmick, which is that they can turn invisible. All you have to do is activate your scanner and then proceed to praise the parry. The fifth archetype is the horse type, which really only has two types of attacks. It can either charge towards you or use its head to execute a combo chain. The difficulty comes from its speed, but as the timing and attack patterns never change, you would have learned them quite well by the midpoint of the game, and therefore removing the excitement that was once there. Lastly, we have the most boring enemy type in the whole game. It's an enemy that gates your progress, is masochistic, and has the ability to spawn enemies. The saving grace is that it's actually easy to exploit, because if you place yourself on its side and elevate yourself just a bit, it won't spawn any enemies and will instead constantly try to attack you with its corrosive vomit. Although, because you're elevated, it won't actually be able to reach you, rendering it useless and you bored from spamming the attack button over and over. In other words, the problem is that all enemies are animated in a similar way, to the point that you'll rapidly start seeing patterns in all their animations. The initial feeling of excitement when finding a new enemy loses its charm when you realize that it doesn't have much to offer other than the new timing to master and a cool cosmetic. What also makes it less interesting is the fact that none of the enemies seem to be interacting with the world around them. You won't find them looting, dancing, or talking to one another, or anything else that you can actually imagine. They're all shallow husks that patrol a super small area, waiting for the moment that you'll wake them up from their slumber. Another issue that the game has is that death is a fucking joke, because there's no penalty for failing. You just spawn in the last camp that you interacted with and get to retry once more. Those camps are also abundant to the point that during my entire playthrough, I never used even once any of the consumables in my inventory. There was basically no point to it, because you respawn instantly and can rapidly get back to the place that you died. If that wasn't enough, you can also buy an instant revive from the shop, which helps trivialize the situation even more. Speaking of shopping, there's really no incentive for you to take part in the game's economy. There was a lot of vendors that sell either charms, crafting resources, or cosmetics, but it's all for nothing when the game is this easy. I never bothered to change my perks, for example, because they gave a negligible damage or defense boost, which I didn't feel like I needed in the first place. The only reason I ever even spent money in the shop was because of a friendship meter that's tied to the amount that you spend at any given shop. The more money you spend, the more vendors will appreciate you, enticing him to make new items available for purchase. They were never really worth it in my opinion, but I had too much money from enemy drops, so I ended up just buying a bunch of stuff that I didn't need just to max out their bar. The same sentiment is representative of the upgrade trees. Most of the perks feel like they should have been part of the basic layout. For example, you can unlock the option of dodging around the enemy when the prompt is blue. You can unlock the same but backwards when the prompt is purple. How about hitting the enemy after executing a perfect dodge? How about the ability to sneak kill an unsuspected victim, or the ability to dash forward towards an enemy? Worst is that I've actually named most of them. Although, you do unlock 2 more skill trees later on, but that's only available in the second half of the game, which is too late in my opinion. The rest of the perks mainly make the game easier, like making a successful parry window bigger. You can also regenerate more energy for your power when you successfully parry, you know, that kind of stuff. It doesn't really feel like the gameplay evolves over time. It feels more like you're getting to the point that you should have at the start of the game, which is never a good feeling to have. Especially not for an open world kind of game like it is here. The problem is so big in my opinion that when the game attempts to change the formula by either unlocking the range attack, another type of attack called the burst attack, and the God of War kind of rage mode, it has no lasting effect on the current gameplay strategy. Your ranged weapon has a limited amount of ammo and doesn't do enough damage to be worth integrating to your main moveset. The only exception is when you execute a specific parry, which reveals a weak point on their face. Shooting it does a lot more damage than melee attacks, making it the only instance where it's preferable to switch for your other weapon. Although, those attacks are really rare because the enemy needs to execute an attack that can only be parried by the purple dodge. It therefore never happens because you end up killing the enemy too fast for them to even do it. On the other hand, burst attacks are basically the same as your starter attacks called beta. They get their own energy bar and all attacks are now red instead of white. Rage mode is what it sounds like. It's an overpowered version of yourself where you get to pummel everything in your path for a limited amount of time. Although, I won't be showing it here because it had its own cosmetic, which is a major spoiler in the story. Anyways, for reasons that I previously mentioned, you won't really be using this attack until you get to a boss. And even then, I ended up mainly using it on bosses that the game reuses, which usually only has a stupid amount of extra health and nothing more. Basically, it's very situational and only really helps to elevate the problem that they've purposefully created. It's for all those reasons and more that I genuinely believe that the devs should have scrapped the open world and either made a linear hack and slash, or even better still, made a Fury clone. For those that aren't aware, Fury is an action shoot 'em up where most of the game is centered around you fighting bosses. You basically get to the boss, fight its multiple stages, and once it is defeated, you walk towards the next area while you get some exposition. It's a very basic premise, but one that works really well because every boss builds up on a previous one. Difficulty is then intuitively brought to another level each time, and beating the boss is all about learning its patterns, mastering the parry, and learning to anticipate its next moves. The game also has a huge emphasis on parrying, with the key difference being that it also heals your character. It's an adrenaline-packed game that has style, flair, and is a mostly underutilized genre. Stellar Blade barely tells a story. It could be summarized in a fewer lines than what I did, with the rest being left to interpretation. Bosses are also the most challenging and fun moments of the current build. It's an endurance test because dying makes you restart from the beginning, which can become annoying in the long run. It therefore forces you to get good, which is exciting in the same way as Fury. It's actually so good that it almost makes the monotony of the main game actually worth it. This change of format would also naturally fix some of the issues that I have with the combat. For example, using your ranged weapon would be a feasible way to do damage while you take a breather and attempt to heal. Animation cancellation would make sense here because you're exclusively fighting mammoths that can overpower you just by their sheer size alone. It therefore makes sense that they would be able to stun you and ignore your attacks. Lastly, it would honestly fix the difficulty level that I have for the game because currently there are really only two difficulties, with the third one, which is hard mode, only being accessible once you finish the game. I honestly don't see myself replaying through it just to experience it in the way that it should have been a default setting. Obviously, that's not the game we got, which leads me to the famous question, which is, would I actually recommend you this game when the price drops? After reflecting on it for a while, I would say that it is indeed worth your time if you know what you're getting yourself into. The game is simultaneously casual and relaxing in that you can rapidly put yourself in a trance and let yourself go with the motion. Let the music massage your soul as you explore the world, time your attacks, and grope a shit ton of corpses. Basically, don't play for the story, play for its sex appeal, play for the eye candy that are the graphics, and play for the bosses. They're definitely worth the experience, and not for the difficulty, then for the variety that the game has to offer. If all else fails, the best thing that I can recommend this game on is the fact that it's most probably the best softcore porn game that you'll find on the market. Because honestly, I don't know if you're aware, but there's so much shovelware. Holy fuck, it's so bad. And that's it for this review. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting, and that actually helped you decide if you're gonna buy this game or not. Do let me know in the comment section how you found it, and if your opinion actually differentiates from mine. I'll be really curious to know, because honestly, I think I'm like one of the rare people who didn't enjoy this game. If you look at the basic reviews, most of them are actually in the 80s and 90s, so I don't know. I just felt like sharing my opinion because it seems to be very different from everyone else. Oh, one last thing before I leave. I just hit 1,000 subscribers, and that's fucking awesome. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.